This video will explain the open access policies of the University of Newcastle, the Australian Research Council, the ARC, and the National Health and Medical Research Council, the NHMRC. It will show how researchers that are subject to the policies of these funding bodies can make their publications open access and meet their compliance obligations. If you want to learn more about open access and its benefits, you will find an introductory video in this playlist we have created for Open Access Week 2024. The University of Newcastle Open Access Policy was introduced in September 2023. It requires anyone at the university who is conducting research to make their research outputs openly available upon publication. These outputs should be submitted to NOVA. NOVA is the institutional repository that contains research outputs by university researchers and makes them publicly available for anyone to access. This policy also applies to higher degree research students. A public version of all University of Newcastle theses need to be deposited into NOVA upon completion, and it applies if you are publishing while at the university. You may have heard that the NHMRC Open Access Policy was revised in 2022. Now, all peer-reviewed publications arising from NHMRC-funded research must be made open access immediately upon publication with a Creative Commons Attribution CC BY license. The ARC have their own open access policy. It requires that all research outputs that were wholly or partially funded by the ARC be made open access within 12 months of publication. This policy is due for review. So, how do you make your work open access to comply with these policies? This chart shows the pathways you can take. Firstly, there is the journal-based or gold open access pathway, where you publish in either a fully open access journal or a hybrid journal, and your publication is made open access by the journal, with a Creative Commons license applied. This pathway often requires the payment of an APC, or article processing charge. There is also the repository-based or green open access pathway, where you publish via the subscription model in a hybrid or subscription-only journal. In this pathway, the published article is behind a paywall. However, you may be able to deposit a version of your work into the institutional repository so that it becomes openly available. Before submitting to a journal, it is important to find out which pathways to open access they offer and any associated charges. If you decide to comply with an open access policy by taking the repository-based or green open access pathway, this can be achieved via the NOVA repository. However, you will need to check the publisher's policy or the agreement you signed with them before depositing the publication in NOVA. Only certain versions of the publication can be made open access in an institutional repository. Any preprint or versions before peer review cannot be deposited in NOVA. For compliance with open access policies, a version of the manuscript that has been through peer review needs to be openly available. This leaves 2 remaining versions of papers that you can deposit in NOVA to be in compliance with policy. And those are the author accepted manuscript and the published version. The author accepted manuscript, also known as the postprint, is the version that has undergone the peer review process and has been accepted by the publisher, but has not yet gone through copy editing and typesetting. The publisher may allow this version to be deposited into an institutional repository, but often there will be an embargo period before it can be made openly available. The published version, also known as the version of record, is the final version of your paper that has been copy edited and typeset by the publisher. Usually, you can only deposit this version to Nova if you have published the paper open access. If an article is published under the subscription model, the publisher will usually hold the license to the published version of the work and won't allow it to be shared publicly. They may also have rules about how the author-accepted manuscript can be shared that prevent researchers from complying with funder open access policies. An author addendum can be added to a submission to ensure that an author retains the right to distribute the author-accepted manuscript version and deposit it in an institutional repository. If the publisher accepts this statement, it will allow the author to retain the rights to the author-accepted manuscript and make it openly accessible in Nova immediately upon publication with a Creative Commons Attribution CC BY license. For further information and advice about open access, please speak to your research liaison librarian. Their contact details are available on the University of Newcastle Library website. Thank you for watching. Please check out the other videos in our Open Access Week 2024 series.